Is it worth fitting an aftermarket exhaust to your 125? Well, I did this recently on my CBF 125, and even though most people say it's not worth it, I have a slightly different opinion. I actually do think it's worth it. So here are some of the pros and cons and my opinion, and why I think if you want to, it's definitely worth fitting an aftermarket exhaust to your 125. First off, it's fun. It's a pretty fun process, picking out the exhaust you want, fitting it to your bike. Especially if you like to tinker, it can be really satisfying taking that big ugly exhaust off and putting one on which looks a lot nicer, weighs a lot less, sounds a lot better. It's just one of the most visible mods you can do to your bike, and it really helps to improve the look and feel of it. So I think it's worth it just for that. It's really fun to do, it's really fun to fit, and if you want to learn how to work on bikes, it can be quite fun doing something that's really visible and really obvious, like for example changing the exhaust or changing the bars or something, rather than doing little jobs in the background which, as much as they help to improve your bike, it's not always as satisfying as doing something that's really obvious and you can point at and say, I did that and I'm really proud of it. Second is the sound. This is a reason why most people say it's not good to fit an aftermarket exhaust to your 125, because people put super loud exhaust on their bike, and frankly it looks a little bit obnoxious and it looks a little bit silly riding around with a really loud exhaust on not a very powerful bike. So I went for one that was a bit more in line with the stock volume. I went with a 300mm silencer, which is about maybe 1.5 times as loud as stock, so it's a little bit louder, but it's definitely not obnoxious, it's definitely not going to scare anyone or wake anyone up or anything like that. I do still think it's a little bit silly to put the loudest exhaust you can find on your 125, it just doesn't suit the bike and it just makes you look a little bit weird. But you can still get one that sounds a lot better even without the volume. The tone of this new exhaust is so much deeper than the stock, and I really appreciate that. It gives me so much more enjoyment from my bike because I just love the sound of it now. Of course, sound is subjective, but I've heard so many people saying you will never get a good sound out of a 125, they just don't sound good, and I really don't agree with this after hearing it firsthand. Of course, there are better sounding bikes, but you have to work with what you have. You can definitely improve the stock sound of your 125, even if it doesn't make it sound like some of your dream bikes out there, it still sounds a lot better, obviously in my opinion. If you prefer the new sound and it means that you get more enjoyment out of your bike, or you ride it more often and things like that, then that's great. I see no reason why you shouldn't upgrade it just because other people don't like the new sound. For me, other than the sound, the biggest improvement I got is the look. I just think this new one looks so much nicer than the stock one, and my stock one isn't that bad. You get some bikes with really ugly exhausts. For the CBF 125, the exhaust kind of suits the bike. Yeah, it's big and bulky, but it's still quite slim. It doesn't look out of place at all, but I do think this new one looks a lot nicer, especially with the silver pipes as well. So it was worth it for me to do that just for the sound and the look. And whether that's worth it for you is going to be completely subjective. You gotta weigh up, am I willing to spend money on this just for the sake of making my bike look slightly different? If it's your toy and it's your hobby, then it probably is worth it for you. But here are some of the reasons that people say it's not worth upgrading the exhaust on your 125. The biggest reason I see against upgrading your exhaust is the cost, because it can be quite expensive. Personally, I found one that didn't cost too much, but yeah, if you're putting a new exhaust on your bike, it's not necessarily going to make your bike worth more, so when you come to sell the bike, it's a good idea to put the stock one back on, then sell the aftermarket exhaust separately, and then at least that way you can get a little bit of money out of it. But for me, it's just one of those costs that you're going to have to absorb. If you're thinking I'll buy a £200 exhaust, it's going to make my bike worth more, it's not. Nobody's going to pay extra just because you've put a new exhaust on your 125. So you have to weigh up if it's worth it for you. If it's a bit of fun and it's your hobby, then it's probably worth it. If you're putting it on there because you think you're going to get that money back when you sell it, then no, it's not worth it. As with anything, there are cheaper and more expensive exhausts out there. You don't have to go and buy the most expensive one from the most well-known brand or anything like that. You can find cheaper exhausts. I got this one from Black Widow, and it didn't cost that much at all. Black Widow are a very reputable company, but there's other companies like Lextech, those ones tend to be pretty cheap as well. I don't have first-hand experience with them personally, but for me, when people say the cost, yeah, it's one of those things you have to accept. You're spending money on your bike to make it look and sound different. You're not necessarily going to get that money back. And if it's worth it for you, then that's fine. People sometimes say that it's better just to save the money and buy a new bike with it, but for me, the cost of upgrading this exhaust and the cost of buying a whole new bike were two completely different things. So upgrading the exhaust was like 1/10 the cost of a new bike. So if you get to have more enjoyment out of your bike and maybe even keep it for longer because you prefer the look and sound of it, then that's a great move for me. For you it might be different. If you're buying a new bike next month anyway, then yeah, it's probably best just to save the money and put it towards your new bike. But if you plan on keeping your 125 for longer, or you want to get more enjoyment out of it, then I really don't see it as a poor financial move to invest in a new exhaust on your bike. And again, in my opinion, if you're looking to save money, getting into bikes is not the best hobby for that. Things are expensive, maintenance is expensive, parts and upgrades are very expensive. If you're trying to save money, I wouldn't say skip the exhaust and buy a new bike or something like that. That really doesn't make sense to me, unless the exhaust you're buying is very expensive. I've seen exhaust for a CBF 125 go for like £600. The bike is barely worth that much. That's a bit silly. For me, I would absolutely say it's not worth upgrading your exhaust if you think you're going to get a performance benefit out of it. Let's face it, it's a 125, it can only do so much. If you think a new exhaust is going to make your bike faster, it's just not. The engine can only do so much. So things like lighter parts, a new air filter, a new exhaust, they're not really going to make that much of a difference. And even if they make a difference on paper, you're definitely not going to notice it in the real world. The bikes just aren't that powerful. So yes, if you think I'm going to chuck a new exhaust on my bike and get a few extra horsepower, you're really not. And if you put a full system on your bike, you really should get it tuned to get all the performance benefits out of it. But again, that can cost almost as much as the exhaust costs you. So I really would say, if you're thinking about upgrading your exhaust because you want performance benefits, seriously consider just saving your money and buying a new bike with it. It doesn't have to be a really powerful bike. Even if you're buying something like a 250 or a 300, that's where you're going to see performance benefits, not in trying to upgrade your 125. So if you're thinking of upgrading solely for performance benefits, I'd really say don't do it. It's not going to make your bike faster. Another thing is the sound, and I'll lump the look in with this as well. All of those things are subjective. You might think it sounds awful to have a loud exhaust on a 125. I don't love it personally, I just like the new tone, but you might even think that that sounds weird. That's up to you. You have to decide if it's worth it to spend money just on cosmetics pretty much. For me it was, for you it might not be. That's really subjective. It's not for anyone else, in my opinion, to say yes you should do it or no you shouldn't. Even though I've done it, I'm not necessarily saying that you guys should go do it as well. If you like it, that's great. If you don't, you don't. Obviously that's something you're going to have to consider since it's a personal choice. Just be prepared that the majority of people are going to tell you they don't like the sound of the new exhaust, it sounds weird, it sounds horrible, whatever. If you're okay with that, then that's great. But the majority of people probably aren't going to like what you've done. But in conclusion, I don't subscribe to the common view that it's really not worth upgrading the exhaust on your 125. If you like it, if you think it's fun, if you want to have the fun of fitting a new exhaust to your bike, go ahead and do it. Be aware that you're probably not going to get the money back unless you sell it separately, and even then you might get like half of what you paid for it. And bear in mind that you're not going to see performance benefits, even if you go for the full tune and everything. It's just not going to happen. But if you want to do it for those other reasons, I don't see a problem with it. I had loads of fun fitting mine, and I hope you guys do too. So let me know what you guys think about fitting an aftermarket exhaust to your 125. Do you think it's an awful idea? Have you done it yourself? I'd really be interested to hear. Safe riding, and I'll see you in the next one.
You sorry?